This is George. Is this George? Yes, this is George. Is this George or Jim? George. This is George. Is this Jim? No, this is not Jim. This is George. Who? Who is this? George. This is George. And who is this? Jim. This is Jim. Jim is boy number 1 in this story. Boy number 2 is George. Is Jim boy number 1? Yes, Jim is boy number 1. Is George boy number 2 in the story? Yes, boy number 2 is George. Who is boy number 1? Jim. Boy number 1 is Jim. Who is boy number 2? George. In the story, George is boy number 2. Is George boy number 1? No, George is not boy number 1. George is boy number 2. Boy number 1 is Jim. Jim is boy number 1 and he is in Mexico. Where is Jim? Mexico. Jim is in Mexico. Jim is in Mexico and George is in Australia. Is Jim in Australia? No, Jim is not in Australia. Jim is in Mexico. George is in Australia. Who is in Australia? George. Who is in Mexico? Jim. Jim is in Mexico. Where is George? George is in Australia. Where is Floyd, the cat? Floyd is in Mexico. Floyd is in Mexico with Jim. Is Floyd with George in Australia? No, Floyd isn't with George in Australia. Floyd is with Jim in Mexico. Who is in Mexico? Jim and Floyd. Who is in Australia? George. George is in Australia. Who is boy number 1 in this story? Jim. Boy number 1 is Jim. Who is boy number 2? George is boy number 2. Where is George? He is in Australia. Where is Jim? He is in Mexico. Where is Floyd? He is in Mexico with Jim. What is Floyd? A boy? No, Floyd is not a boy. Floyd is a cat. Who is the cat in the story? Floyd. Floyd is the cat in the story. Where is boy number 1? In Mexico. Boy number 1 is in Mexico. Jim is boy number 1 and he is in Mexico. Where is boy number 2? Boy number 2 is George and he is in Australia. Is Floyd with George in Australia? No, Floyd is not in Australia. Floyd is in Mexico with Jim. Where is the cat? Floyd the cat is in Mexico with Jim. Who is in Mexico? Jim and Floyd. Jim is boy number 1 in the story and he is in Mexico with Floyd the cat. Boy number 2 is George. George is in Australia.